to 10,000 cells, and then each of those have 10,000 connections. And so if your whole vision was foveal in its resolution, you'd have to have a skull like an alien to contain that much brain. And and that's a real indication of that finitude, right? Is that you do have limited cognitive resources, and limited means practically and physically limited, but it also means metabolically limited. The cost of running your brain is already extremely high. And so you're going to shepherd your available attentional resources because they are finite, and they're finite in no small part because they are technically, metabolically costly. That all seems okay?
So I would add one thing to that, which is I would put an emphasis on how this process has to be self-organizing, because we want to avoid a perennial problem, which you and I both know shows up in psychology, which is to posit the internal homunculus that actually doesn't explain the problem, but just shifts it. The central executive is an example of this, etc. So we don't want to say that there's someone that's doing the prioritization, because that someone
is just as mysterious.
Right, and is facing the very problem that we're trying to explain. So right, the process has to be dynamically self-organized.
One of the ways I've realized how that problem works is in an attempt to solve the mind-body problem, because you can't solve the mind-body problem. But you can say, let's say you want to explore an idea, and you decide to do that by writing an essay. So then you sit down in front of the computer, which is not an idea. It's actually that you're sitting, and then you move your fingers on the keyboard. And so there's a hierarchy of transformation from mind, which might be the abstract intent, to body. And so the spirit hits the body in the finger movements. And then the spirit disappears in some sense under the finger movements, because you can move your fingers voluntarily, but you have no idea what muscles you're moving to do that. And you can't control the cells or anything like that.
Oh, I did that with my students in a lecture this morning. I was talking about this very fact that I said, put up your finger. Okay, bend your finger. What do you do to bend your finger?
Right, exactly. It's so interesting, eh? It's so interesting that you have that level of consciousness at that level of detail, which is pretty detailed, but no more than that.
Yes.
So that's a mystery, man. That localization of consciousness between the body and part of the spirit. There's like a what would you call it? There's a bandwidth. There's a bandwidth of resolution for consciousness.
Yes.
And why that band? See, the social psychologists who studied language sort of cottoned on to this, because one of the things they realized was that short words, first of all, short words tend to be old words.
Yes.
So, because as language develops, words that are used a lot get more efficient. But the short words also map extraordinarily well onto the self-evident level of perception. And so, for example, a short word is cat, because a cat presents itself for some reason to our perception. The species cat doesn't, and the fur of the cat in some sense doesn't. It's the cat.
Yes.
And you can see that primary object level recognition.
Basic level.
Basic level. That's right.
Rush.
Yes.
Level.
Yes. And so you see that with babies, because they get doggy pretty damn fast. And that's because the language maps onto the primary domain of perception, that basic level perception, quite nicely. And that is associated with something like the natural bandwidth of consciousness.
Yeah, I would say that lines up with, if Rush's explanation is, you're getting the best trade-off between differences between category and similarities within categories.
Right, and then the question is, what does best trade-off mean?
Exactly, and for me, that'd be a little bit of, I guess, a nuance I'd want to put onto the prioritization, because the prioritization sounds very much sort of like an imposition, whereas I think what we're talking about is something more like what Merleau-Ponty talked about when he talked about optimal gripping, right? So what's the correct distance to look at this? Well, it depends, because if I zoom in, I lose the gestalt. If I zoom out, I lose the detail.
Yeah, it depends on what you want to do.
Exactly.
Yes, well, that's it. That's why I'm kind of attracted to pragmatism. It's like, well, to some degree, our theories of truth need to be embedded in the practicalities of action. And so, is that a grippable object that I can drink from? Well, I want my perception to match that problem.
Yeah, but it doesn't, I think that if you understand that the prioritization let's say that you have heaven and earth. I'm going to use mythical categories, but so you have,
That's fine.
you have heaven and earth, and that it's the way in which heaven meets earth is a mutual relationship, right? We always see it as a relationship of lovers, you could say. So it's not, the prioritization isn't just about an imposition from above, but it's about the manner in which that which is above, let's say the hierarchy, is able to encounter the potential in which it's...
We were talking about that last night. So Jonathan made this funny joke last night. We were talking about Sam Harris, and Sam Harris has this line of argumentation where, and he used this on me, where I interpreted a biblical story and then he interpreted a recipe.
Yes.
And he said, well, look at all the interpretations. And that is a problem of
semiotic drift. Yes.
Exactly. Well, it's also a problem of this horizon of infinite possibility. There are multiple interpretive schemes.
Yes.
So Jonathan said he'd like to do a video where he shows that a recipe is actually necessarily embedded inside a mythological framework. And we started to talk about that because imagine, well, the recipe implies that you need to make an edible meal, that you want to make an edible meal, that you're going to serve it to family and friends, that's part of a kind of communion, that you think that's a good thing, that's worth spending time on, that serves your family and friends, that's maybe nested in something like an ethic of service to the community. Like there's a whole network of purpose.
I would add more to that. There's all kinds of implicit assumptions that I can capture in a sequence of propositions, procedural skills that are not completely capturable in words, and that those procedures and skills can also map on to the particular virtues and skill, that people are bringing to it. Like, it's like most things can't be solved by a recipe, and yet, so a recipe is a significant cognitive cultural achievement, and we don't recognize and we tend to overgeneralize the things we think for which we can provide recipes. This is one of the
That's an algorithm issue.
Yes, exactly. And so there's lots. Yeah.
But even in the recipe itself, you will notice that the way in which we name things and the way in which we order things will be related to a normal prioritization, hierarchy prioritization. But if you're making chicken, you'll have the chicken and then you'll have the spices, and you'll understand that these elements that I'm adding are spices, and that they're let's say something like a marginalia that I'm adding to the central meal. Yeah. It's actually it's the pattern of a church, actually, where you have a movement towards the central identity that we understand, and then we have the way in which it's complemented through other things. And so even the recipe itself is like a little microcosm.
And also the judgment you use is like, well, how much spice? Yeah. Well, the answer is, well, what function is the spice going to serve? And you say, well, I want to add a little zest and interest to my cooking. And so then you have a philosophy of zest and interest that's associated with that, because just predictable chicken isn't good enough. And maybe you want to put a